Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast, episode 97.
Welcome to the Out of Order Podcast, your window into the firearms community, exploring those shaping the future of our rights and protecting our lifestyle, laws, legal cases, activism, and self-defense in a candid and honest podcast for our brothers and sisters in arms. Here's your host, James Kalita.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 97 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Show notes page for today's episode is outoforderjameskalita.com/97. Today's sponsor is Gift for Gun Nuts, giftforgunnuts.com, where you get daily updates with gift ideas for the hunting and shooting sports enthusiast on your holiday shopping list. So head over to Gift for Gun Nuts. You'll find great multi-tools, flashlights, all sorts of great things over at giftforgunnuts.com. Today's guest is Liz Lazarus. Liz is the author of Free of Malice. And now, here's Liz.
Liz Lazarus, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So, Liz, you're the author of two books. Would you tell us a little about those?
Sure. The two books are called Free of Malice. That came out in 2016. My second one, Plea for Justice, came out this year, 2018, in May. They are both psychological legal thrillers, pro Second Amendment, but a lot of education. My goal is to entertain and to educate. So the first one actually was based on a real event in my life. I was a senior at Georgia Tech, just living off campus, when a guy broke into my house in the middle of the night. I was super lucky. I managed to fight him off. But afterward, I started to journal to heal. You know, back then, nobody really knew about PTSD, so we didn't think to send me to therapy. We didn't think about the after effects. I mean, we made sure the house was secure and that I was physically secure, but mentally I was still pretty traumatized. So I journaled about that night and the changes to my life. But then the two things that really triggered the book were, the first thing was I had said to my brother-in-law, who was a volunteer deputy, if I had owned a gun, I would have shot the guy when he was sleeping. And he countered that it was good that I hadn't, because the way I described it, the guy was retreating. I would have shot him in the back off my property, and he didn't think that would be seen as self-defense. So that really piqued my curiosity about where's that line between self-defense and vigilantism. And then the second reason that I wrote the book was after my parents came up, right after the attack, my mother asked a question, and very atypical for her, kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, wow, that would make a killer ending to the book, and a nice twist. So I won't tell you her question now. I'll wait till after you've read the book, but then I'll be happy to tell you, and it'll explain the ending and why you got the twist that you did. I wasn't planning to write another book, but the response and reviews of the first one were so good, and so many people asked for, when's the next one, that I set out to write a second book. And they all have to do with the justice system, with learning about guns and learning about gun safety and education. The first one I teach about PTSD a little bit. The second one I teach more about self-defense. So I've always tried to make them entertaining and educational.
And you didn't set out to be an author. You started out as you are an engineer, and you have your MBA. And so, I mean, how much time went by between the incident and when you decided to turn it into a novel?
Oh, years and years. I tried not to write the book, and you're right. I have an engineering degree from Tech and an MBA from Northwestern. I spent my career at General Electric in the healthcare division. You think, what is a woman who's an engineer, businesswoman doing writing thrillers? But it really the first one just wouldn't leave me alone. The best way to describe it is it was a calling. And I had pretty much exhausted so many other things on my bucket list. I had gotten my MBA, I'd lived overseas, I'd gotten my pilot's license. I was like checking off my bucket list. And this little book just kept knocking, saying, when are you going to write me? And so it was many, many years later. But it probably was good that it was many, many years later, because, I was no longer traumatized from the event. And I had more resources at my disposal to make sure I did it right, as far as, finding editors, finding people to help consult with the book. I worked with 3 criminal defense lawyers. I worked with an EMDR therapist. So, the timing was good, even though it was many, many years later.
And so your second book, is it a sequel? Is it standalone? Could you tell us a little more about that one?
It is standalone. It's and again, I wasn't intending to write more, but people were asking, and I thought, well, what do I like to write about? I like to write about strong characters. The first two have been female, but doesn't mean they'll always be female. I like to show a journey of growth. I'd like to educate. The first one, my character Laura learns to shoot. And so for the second one, I thought, well, why don't I make my character learn to carry? Because I was going through the process to learn to carry. So the second one, the completely different characters. It's about a woman named Jackie. She's best friends in high school with a boy named Aaron. And Aaron is the typical cool jock, popular kid. And Jackie's less popular, has pretty poor body image and self-image. But they're friends kind of on the down low. And right after high school, he drops her without a word, no explanation. Obviously, it hurts her feelings because he was her best friend, but she goes on to go to school and becomes a paralegal. And then 10 years later, Aaron is arrested for killing a girl. The media dubs him the Snapchat killer because he allegedly took video of this girl before he killed her. Instead of going to trial, he agrees to a plea deal and goes to prison. And from prison, he reaches out to Jackie to help prove he's innocent. In this book, where the first book is told from Laura's point of view, where she is uncovering what would have happened had she shot and killed her attacker, the second one is told from Jackie's point of view as she goes through the evidence from the case and the trial that never happened. And it's told from the point of view of a character called Me, who is the bad guy. And the chapters alternate back and forth. So you read from Jackie's point of view, then you read from the killer's point of view. And I had a ton of fun researching that. My killer is really savvy, IT smart. And so you don't know if it's Aaron or not till the end. And there are a couple more twists. Where the first one has one big twist at the end. The second one has a couple twists throughout.
Wow, that sounds like a really challenging book to write, too. To have to sort of get into the mindset of those two different characters.
Yeah, well, engineering helped me. I do a really detailed layout of all the chapters so I can keep track of what happens when. And one of the best books I read for getting into the killer's mind was by John Douglas, The Anatomy of Motive, where he's a former FBI profiler who interviewed a lot of the worst of the worst who were captured. So, yeah, and I make sure my friends know that. I had one friend, she's in my Well-Armed Women group, and she's like, man, I couldn't sleep. It was like Silence of the Lambs, kind of scary. And she goes, where did that come from? And do I really know you? And I'm like, no, it's fiction, trust me.
Wow. Right. So what advice do you have for women when they're first purchasing a firearm, when they're learning how to carry? Because your books kind of talked about that. So what would you like to share about that?
Well, a great question, because I show kind of in the first book how to do it the wrong way, and in the second book how to do it the right way. For me, in the first book, when Laura decides she wants a gun and her husband is against it, so I had a little fun with that debate. But she goes to the range, gets an instructor, and buys the gun right away. For me in real life, after the attack, we should have had an alarm in the first place. People ask what would I have done differently. We should have had an alarm. But we did get one after I was attacked. But I wanted more, so I went with my boyfriend to the gun range, and we, I think, tried two guns, and he picked out the one for me he liked best. It was typical Guns 101 what not to do, because it turns out it was too big for my hand. I didn't realize that at the time. But and I hear so many stories from women where the husband or the boyfriend buys them their first gun. And the misnomer that if it's small, it's better, which is not true, because if it's small, it's got more recoil. But I shot the Ruger well, and I was pretty accurate with it. But then on my second book, when Jackie learns to carry, I went with a certified instructor. We tried about 10 guns, looked at all the pros and cons of each one, and picked my carry gun. It's a SIG 938 based on doing it the right way. So my advice is find someone who's knowledgeable. The first guy that took me to the range was not an instructor. Hence, I used the word clip instead of magazine in my first book, which just makes me cringe now. And So, but go with someone who's an instructor, who's certified, who you get along well with, and have them let you try lots of different firearms before you make your decision. I'm choosing my accuracy gun next, and it's down to between a SIG and an HK, and I've tried them side by side twice now just to make sure I pick the right one for me.
Oh, great. And you mentioned that your characters may not always be female. Are you planning another book?
I am. I'm working on a third book right now, and it alternates like the second one between a female character and a police detective. So I guess when I say my characters, my protagonists are usually female. And this one, I've got kind of two protagonists, the police detective and the woman who owns a restaurant. I recently met a guy who's been a private investigator his whole life, and he's interested in doing a story. So at some point I'll have my protagonist be a guy, could even be a child at some point. I mean, I'm kind of on a roll now. I've got the current book I'm working on and a fourth one already in my mind of what I'm going to write.
Oh, wow. So after the first one, what sort of, do you have any idea like where the inspiration comes from after the unfortunate incident inspired the first book, but where does the inspiration for the other ones come from?
Well, I think once I figure out the ending, the plot, kind of the plot and an ending. For the second one, I said I want a strong female character. I want some twist. I want some legal education. I want some firearms education. So I don't know how that comes to me. When I write, the best way to describe it is like watching a movie and taking notes. It's really like I'm watching what's happening and taking the notes of it versus always even thinking of it myself.
Huh.
And then the third one, the beginning came from my dear friend Esther Schneider. She's on the NRA board. And she told me about a book she was thinking about and told me about like the opening scene, and it was fabulous. And so but she didn't think she was ever going to write it. So I said, well, can I borrow the opening scene? And she's like, yeah. So that's what started that one. And the fourth one is going to come most likely from my friend Dawn Hillier. She owns Hiding Hilda. She had a stalker for years. And in fact, he's still tormenting her, unbelievably. And I'll probably tell her story, though fictionalized.
Oh, wow. So, you've there's a lot of pro-gun, tones throughout the book. Have you gotten any negative feedback from the anti-gun community?
Not really, and I would say it's pro self-protection. Because it's the first thing I say to anybody is I should have had an alarm, right? Not that an alarm can scare people away per se, but it's all about having more self-awareness and self-protection. And in the second book, I feature RAD, which is Rape Awareness Defense Training, where it's not with firearms. It's using your voice, using your body, using your strength. So I think I like to think of it as more well-rounded than just pro-gun. It's pro self-protection. And when you read the book, anybody who criticizes it, obviously I say you haven't read it, because it's all about the gun safety and gun laws. Like, my character Laura would have been better off to not have shot because the guy was retreating, and she could have shut the door, called 911. It's fictional, so we don't know what the ending would have been, but the 3 lawyers that I worked with all thought I probably would have gotten, or the character would have gotten manslaughter versus being acquitted. But it makes for a fun debate because people with different perspectives have different, well, I would let her go, or no, she couldn't have done that. It's a fun debate for people to say what they think they would have done had they been on the jury of this case.
Right. Yeah. And it's hard, and I've interviewed some self-defense lawyers on the show, and I've never, when they're talking about self-defense shooting, I before reading your book, I hadn't really considered, being the victim of a crime and then having the opportunity to, shoot my attacker and then having to decide to let them go. And that seems like a really hard choice to have to make. And, whether we could make the right one. I've always, I guess my fear has always been, would I be able to shoot someone if I needed to? But then, at the same time, would I be able to resist if I shouldn't? And it's a very different paradigm to consider.
Well, in the debate that I had so Alison Frutos was the criminal defense lawyer who helped me the most with the first book. So if you think the Thomas character, the lawyer, is clever, it's thanks to Alison. But anytime I'd bring up an argument, she could bring up the counter argument. And one of the things I said to her was, okay, it's the middle of the night, it's 4 a.m, he kicks open my bedroom door. The first awareness I have of him in my room is his silhouette in the doorway. And I started fighting and screaming, and he finally gave up because I wasn't giving up. And in fact, at one point he said, if you shut up, I'll leave. And I thought to myself, I'm not shutting up, I'm screaming louder. And so as he retreated, I didn't all of a sudden think, okay, he's retreating and I'm now the aggressor. My brain was still in I'm being attacked mode. And I said that to her. I said, you don't just all of a sudden think, wait, I'm now the aggressor. And she talked about the cooling off period, and it really would have been up to a jury of how they would have seen that, or did they think he was still a continued threat to me. But what I love about the book, and especially people who read it before any incident ever happens to them, it gives them a chance to think about that, because I would have never even occurred to me. It never occurred to me to have an alarm, a firearm, or what I would do if someone broke into the house.
So is there a like one takeaway that you hope everyone gets from reading your books?
Oh, just one, huh? Well, I hope the biggest takeaway is just having an enjoyment reading it, having an enjoyable read. So I hope they find it just fun and entertaining. But I guess on a serious note, the takeaway is to really understand the laws before you decide to own a firearm.
Yeah, absolutely. Very important. And so I always ask my guests if there are books that they recommend, and I'll put links to both of yours on the show notes page. Any that you recommend all gun owners read, or about politics or defense or firearms or anything like that?
Well, so Masada Ayub, I love his books. I read In the Gravest Extreme. I read Paxton Quigley's books, Armed and Female. These were all for research for me, but those were both great. What else have I read? The Gift of Fear is a standby. The Laws of Self-Defense. I'm just now reading Assassination Generation by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman. He was so gracious. He wrote one of the back cover endorsements on my second book, and I just heard him speak and just so appreciate everything he says. If you get a chance to listen to him, he's just fabulous. He was talking about violent video games and TV and how that's warping our children's minds these days. And that's what Assassination Generation is about. And I got the audiobook so I can listen to him. So, I should put a list out. I got all kinds I listen to or read.
Yeah, audio books are wonderful things. I would be perpetually distracted and never finish a single book. I downloaded one of Masada Ayub's books that wasn't available on audio onto my Kindle 2 years ago, and I have not finished it yet. And it was not a long book, but I read, I start thinking about it, and then it's hours later.
So speaking of which, the audiobook for my first one, Free of Malice, came out. It's on Audible. And the narrator did such a good job. She's fabulous. She was able to interpret the emotion just right and do Thomas's male voice and Laura's female voice. People had asked me if I was going to narrate, and I'm like, no way, I'm not that talented. So yeah, and the reason we did it finally is I was on a book tour. I went 22 states, did over 50 book talks, and people kept asking about it. So I'm like, okay, we got to bite the bullet. We got to put out an audiobook.
Great. Yeah. That was actually how I listened to it. So, yes. Wow, 22 states.
Yeah. I don't know how I did it looking back. It was in 17, because this year has been more about getting the third book going.
Right. So how can people find you? How can people find your books?
Well, so they can find more about me on my website, lizlazarus.com. That's LIZLAZARUS.com. It's got links to Amazon and Barnes & Noble to buy the books. The first book has some music that goes with it, so you can hear the music that goes with the book, like a theme song. It also has a trailer to watch. And then, a lot of good content, my media kit, synopsis. It's got a free download as well. So you can read the first couple chapters to see if you like the style of writing before you purchase the whole book.
Oh, great. And I thank you very much for being on the show. Any parting words for our listeners?
So I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. Author Liz Lazarus. I should mention that. So I'd love to hear from people now that you know the backstory. Love to hear what people think of Free of Malice, and feel free to reach out when you're done, and I'll tell you that question that Mom asked that inspired the ending. I tell you, most people don't guess the ending. I'd say maybe 10% guess the ending. So I always love to talk about who they thought the bad guy was and share what that question was and what made me think of that ending.
Great. Absolutely. All right. Well, I thank you very much for being on the show, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Well, thank you, James. It's been my pleasure. You're doing a great interview.
Thanks again for tuning in to episode 97 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Show notes page for today's episode is outoforderjameskalita.com/97. Please head over to the show notes page. You'll find links to both of Liz's books and to lizlazarus.com. And thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.